Welcome back, everybody. We've got the unit number 4 Transoceanic interaction video for you. This one's going to cover the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean Trade Network. This is going to be part of our Europe Starts Flexing on the World series that we're moving into. Today, we're just going to focus primarily on Portugal and what Portugal does as a disruptive force in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and also what they don't do as a disruptive force in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Now, you might remember from Mrs. Dumas' Unit 2 Networks of Exchange Seafaring People exchange video, the network of exchange in the Indian Ocean had been long established, and it was primarily a way of connecting people in the eastern and western parts of the Indian Ocean, utilizing the monsoon winds as a force to move people around. What this does is limit the number of participants to anybody with coastal real estate on the Indian Ocean, and also serve to limit the seasons that trade could take place. But what we start to see is that by the 12th and 13th centuries, many technological advances start to lead to more participation and more time periods that trade could take place. And what we really begin to see is that the Indian Ocean Trade Network expands as a result of this. So you still are going to see primarily seasonal trade because the winds are very substantial and powerful. But what you are going to also see is that as technology develops and as we have more of the compasses and the astrolabes and the lateen sails and the various technological advances that are being made during the latter stages of the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, or through the creation of more interaction with the Arab world and the Eastern world, the refinement of the compass, what we start to see is that more and more people are going to become involved. And so this area of exchange, this network of exchange, tends to grow. The main dominating forces, though, are going to be India and the Mughal Empire. We'll have the Ottomans, who are going to be controlling this territory here. And then down here on the eastern coast of Africa and over here in the Straits of Malacca, we're going to also have Islamic and some Christian trading taking place as well. But noticeably absent are the Europeans. The Europeans, though, will start to expand into the Indian Ocean Trade Network primarily after the Reconquista, or reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And that brings our European sailors into the Indian Ocean Trade Network and starts to serve as a disruptive force. So let's hop into a deeper dive exploration of Portugal and what's taking place on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the Portuguese are going to utilize some of their own technological innovations, like shipbuilding innovations that lead to the carrack, a much larger sailing ship, and the caravel, a smaller sailing ship. Even when you look at it, you're like, hey, that looks a lot like an Islamic dhow ship, especially with these triangular lateen sails. And then we're going to also mash up the Chinese compass and the Muslim-influenced and Chinese-influenced astrolabe into a series of technological innovations and an explosion in shipbuilding and maritime prowess, right? So where did all of this technology come from? How did this make its way into the hands of the Europeans and the Portuguese specifically? Well, the Portuguese and the Spanish both were endowed with a lot of technology after the Reconquista, because the Arab world had been, the nursemaid for classical knowledge, mathematics, science, and because the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by the Moors, all of this technology and knowledge was housed inside of Europe. So once a new, stronger European monarch is able to take over, what occurs is that monarch has access to all that technology. And Prince Henry the Navigator is that monarch for Portugal. And then he realizes, hey, I'm on the ocean, in this case, the Atlantic Ocean. I'm very close to the Mediterranean trade network that's been thriving for, thousands of years. I have an opportunity here to expand my kingdom and expand my realm utilizing this technology. So he founds a school for navigation. He founds a school and invests very heavily in shipbuilding and just the practice of being a seafaring nation. And the Portuguese, in very short order, will become a major player, mainly in the Indian Ocean trade network, but increasingly, as time will go on, in the Atlantic world as well. Now, in order to make that journey to the Indian Ocean trade network, the Portuguese were going to have to round Africa. And in so doing, they're going to have to go around the Cape of Storms, or the Cape of Hope, down in what is now South Africa. This is very treacherous water. It's very deep. You've got a lot of storms that are coming off of the Antarctic continent. You've got a lot of really unpredictable wave patterns. And so to make this journey is going to be really, really perilous. But the Portuguese, owing in large part to that school of navigation and the mashup, the syncretic cultural aspects of the Iberian Peninsula, are going to be able to make this journey. And they're going to be able to do this using their caravels, as a way to tack through the wind, make it around that treacherous shoreline, and become very, very successful. And so the Portuguese, once they are able to successfully navigate and re-navigate the Cape of Storms and make their way into the much more placid and calm waters of the Indian Ocean, relative to what you're seeing down there in the Antarctic Ocean, what ends up occurring is that you have this disruptive force, right? So check out the video if you want a little bit more on that one. Let's take a deeper dive now into what the Portuguese are actually going to do. Now, the Portuguese are a relatively small kingdom. They don't have a ton of land. They don't have a ton of population, so they're not going to be able to just come in and conquer a lot of these established powers. But what the Portuguese do have is they do have these ships that turn out to be really technologically advanced. And while the Chinese and the Arab world, they're also producing advanced ships, they're not going into the Indian Ocean trade network with the same mentality as the Portuguese, which is to come in and dominate, right? So when Prince Henry and his fleet makes its way into the Indian Ocean, what they start to do is realize there's a lot of these trade hub cities that are, just dominated by these local empires, but we could potentially cut them off or take them over, utilizing our superior ships and our cannons as a way of expanding. And this process of expansion, we know this works because the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Safavids, all those gunpowder empires that we know that were dominating land, utilized gunpowder and cannon to be a force multiplier, and the Portuguese are going to do the same thing. And so what they're going to start to do is they're going to set up these bases along the way. And so as we see the Portuguese progress deeper and deeper and deeper into the Indian Ocean, they start to take over more and more territory as like these kind of home-based territories. They're not going to control the entire kingdom. They're not looking to conquer. They're looking to dominate trade and make some money off of that trade, right? So in pretty short order, what we see is the Portuguese, from the period of time of their reconquest at the beginning of the 15th century to about the midpoint of the 15th century, are starting to export Christianity, they're starting to export European culture, and they're starting to dominate key trade cities. And that's the key piece of information here. They want to make sure that they dominate the trade cities. They're going to try to make as much money as they can off the movement of goods, just like any other merchant will, but they want to dominate the city. So they need to figure out this way of, once they get into a city like a Calcutta, for example, how do you dominate trade, right? And how do you establish a means of control over the long term? Because the further and further, if we go back, the further and further you get away from Portugal and deeper into the Indian Ocean, the less of a presence you're going to have. And your cannons can only go so far. So the Portuguese start to turn towards some regional setup areas. So you can think of them in a similar way that you can have a cultural diaspora that we talked about in unit number 2. What the Portuguese start to do is they start to set up small trading houses where they can have an extension of their government. They can have an extension of their empire into the Mediterranean or into the Indian Ocean world. And therefore they could have like a home base region. In this case, we're looking at the Swahili coast, where they are in control of much of the territory, but not all of the territory. And that's the key here, right? Don't take over everything, take over some of the territory, take over the best trading cities, right? And then utilize your advanced technology as much as you can to keep everybody else out. Now, when the Portuguese make their way into Africa, they're going to be confronted with some of the religious hostilities and tensions that were left over from the Arab conquest of North Africa and the jihad that brought Islam into the Iberian Peninsula in the first place, as well as their own cultural attitudes towards Arab people. And so what we tend to see is that the Portuguese are going to target for conquest more Arab people, but in this case here in Ethiopia, where we have an old sect of Christianity, the Portuguese being much more willing to sort of stand off, right? And that's going to be a major theme as we get deeper into units 5 and 6, is those cross-cultural connections and utilizing those connections as much as you can for as long as you can for independence. Now, the Portuguese are not just going to be in Africa, they're also going to make their way into India. And we're going to see that same pattern of expansion that we saw on the eastern coast of Africa and what we saw taking place up in the Mediterranean, also occurring in in India as well. And so over the course of roughly 60 years, the Portuguese go from this very small, isolated kingdom to a major power broker in the Indian Ocean trade network, utilizing this simple plan. They're going to show up. They're going to utilize their ships. They're going to utilize their cannon. They're going to identify the most important cities, and then slowly, one after the other, they'll take over these cities. They'll set up their own small extension trade areas, and then they are going to put like that cherry on top, the master plan of control. They're going to utilize the cartaz. The cartaz is the way that the Portuguese are really going to become wealthy overall. And so the cartaz is a trading pass. So if you want to trade in one of these conquered cities, and again, if we go back, we can see that the Portuguese have really rolled up a pretty impressive number of cities on the Mediterranean, coastal inlet regions, on the Indian Ocean, on the western coast of India, and on the eastern coast of Africa. And then they implement the cartaz, which is this trade pass, which is essentially a tax. They're going to utilize some currency houses, like a bank. You can think about those banking houses that we talked about on the Silk Road. They're going to utilize their superior technology as much as possible to dominate those regions that they've really set up in, and they're going to choke off trade to anybody else. In this way, the Portuguese kind of lay down a blueprint for the rest of Europe on how to become rich, right? Now, if you're Spain, if you're England, if you're France, going into the Indian Ocean trade network will net you some riches. There's other people there. There's other territory to be had, but you're going to probably look somewhere else to get rich because the Portuguese really have started to control as much of the territories they can. The Chinese are doing some small scale trading in the South China Sea. The Mughals and Ottomans are definitely still major power brokers, and overall, for Europeans to continue to expand into the Indian Ocean trade network is not going to be a reality overall. There's just too many people there, and that kind of leads us to this idea of Europe going out into the world and finding their own pathways to becoming rich. And that also kind of helps us dispel a myth about the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean trade network as well. The Portuguese didn't just come in, take over, and totally disrupt the Indian Ocean trade network in a way that made it like them the chief movers and shakers on this trade network. Think about like the Mongols on the Silk Road. In fact, the Portuguese never really become this massive power as much as they just become really good at exploiting the technology, the cartaz, as a way of getting rich. And again, their focus is mainly going to be on money, right? And so the Portuguese don't come in and destroy the network, don't come in and dominate the network. They come in and they exploit some niche areas to create their own systems of wealth and power inside of the Indian Ocean trade network. They effectively seal off some of the last major areas that could have been conquered by other Europeans, and that's going to send Spain and France and England to North America to take a look at what's over there in terms of getting rich as well. And for more on that, you're going to have to check out the video that Mrs. Dumas posted on Spain, the New World, and Atlantic trade. All right. So overall, make sure that you guys have that strong understanding of the motivations for Portugal in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Make sure you go back and review the technologies that made it possible for the Portuguese to gain access to the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And remember, for the Portuguese, they weren't looking to set up massive land empires. They were looking for economic exploitation. Look forward to having you guys on the next video.